Hello everyone, welcome to Deep Dive into the Archives. Today on Deep Dive into the Archive, we are going to be talking about Get to Heaven by Everything Everything.
This is the British art rock band's third studio album, coming out in 2015, although written in 2014. That year, 2014, heavily influences a lot of the lyrics that appear on this album.
This is kind of the album for them that I think they really perfected their sound. It is just this bright, groovy, super warm, fun sounding art pop, art rock album. It's such a bright sounding mix of art pop and art rock and like electronica also, I guess, a little bit, and maybe a little bit of indie rock. The best way actually I think to describe it is Imagine Dragons if Imagine Dragons was good and talented. This is an album that I think literally everyone can get into. It's super accessible, but also still has this experimental edge to it. You have the opener to The Blade, which is it feels very similar to that kind of popular indie rock that was present in the 2010s. It sounds a lot to me like an artist like Bastille or something in a lot of ways, but it's so bright and vibrant and groovy. The production on this album is fantastic. It is so rich sounding. It's wonderful. There's a ton of layers to the instrumentation.
Yeah, I'd have to agree. I especially love the explosive chorus on the intro to The Blade. Really makes that track, brings it all together.
It just starts with this very quiet, understated, mainly just vocals, but there's these kind of interesting, electronic noises in the background.
There's a lot of synths throughout the entire album.
And just, the way it explodes into the chorus and, the power that occurs on it, and especially the bass on the chorus and throughout this entire album, is so fantastically done. It's just, it's so groovy, it's super catchy. It transitions into Distant Past, which it's a super groovy track again. Throughout the track, there's these backing vocals that shout Distant Past, as specifically during the pre-chorus and choruses. There's such a fun sound to it, I guess.
It's definitely a really catchy track. Distant Past is easily one of my favorites off the album. The way the lead singer, Jonathan Higgs, his falsetto voice, which he goes into a lot throughout this album, he hits some very high notes, which is very impressive. But he really kind of brings it in full force on this track, and it sounds really good. The chorus in the falsetto voice sounds really great and super catchy, super fun. One thing we should mention is that despite how fun and groovy this album is, the lyrical themes are a bit darker. They got that hey ya thing going on where if you look into the lyrics, they're quite depressing. For example, Distant Past is about how history repeats itself, and specifically the bad parts of history repeat themselves.
I mean, this album is fairly political a lot of the time, and definitely there's consistent themes of war and death. There's a song, Feature 500, for example, is about someone assassinating the Queen of England. Which I guess that sounds goofy, but the way it's presented is very, serious and kind of disturbing. I think that aspect actually works very well for the album. I like how this album is, very accessible, but also with the lyrical themes, it kind of, for anyone who looks deeper into it, there's a lot to dive into.
Yeah, I have to agree. Despite all this, Get to Heaven, the next track, is probably one of the more uplifting ones.
I sort of...
I interpret it more as about, ignoring the horrors and, terrors of the present world and just, kind of just ignoring all that stuff, not worrying about it, and just thinking about a better future.
Yeah, sort of. I think it's more... I guess personally I found it to be more about how people ignore problems and terrible things that happen in the world and focus on things that are very, mundane. So you have, the chorus where Jonathan says, I'm thinking, what was my password? There's definitely this, idea that, people are kind of ignoring all of, the awful stuff that's happening and just focusing on things that don't matter that much, or maybe are just our tendency to do that. And definitely this track is also has such a like sweet sounding chorus. I think it's something that I love about this album is a lot of the choruses are very like almost sugary sweet, with Jonathan's falsetto vocals often complementing the very bright and vibrant guitar work. I want to also mention that like this song's sound especially I think complements the like themes through the lyrics. It's a much quieter track I'd say than the previous two. It's not as like boisterous or in your face. I think that complements these themes of like ignoring like bad things really well.
The next track, Regret. On the surface, it's about regret.
Damn, what clued you into that?
I really had to dig through all the annotations on Genius to get that one.
Yeah. I mean, that is pretty much just what the song is about like having regrets. You always like imagine how you could have done something differently and changed it, but like you can't, essentially. There's no point in doing so. I especially love the repeated backing vocals saying regret, regret.
The way they chant, it just really solidifies that sort of idea.
Yeah, it's like this constant like nagging at the back of your brain. Especially the way that these verses occur, they're very like they kind of like plod along. You have this very clear contrast between the like main vocal line from Jonathan and then the backing vocals that shout out like regret, regret. It makes for like a very like groovy track, honestly.
It is definitely a very groovy track, and so is the next track, Spring, Sun, Winter, Dread. He is not naming all the seasons; he just names 2 of the seasons. Sometimes when singing along to this, I still say spring, summer, winter, dread, even though I'm like, fuck, it's sun, not summer.
I want to say that Spring, Sun, Winter, Dread is like, the song is maybe my favorite on the album. It has like this staccato rhythm to it that is just super catchy, and Jonathan's vocals fit like perfectly within that rhythm. I especially love the chorus and how like throughout it, this rhythm kind of evolves and you get again, Jonathan's vocals that just are so like sweet sounding, especially with the refrain that happens after them that just complements them so well. I especially love the outro to this track.
Oh, the outro to this track is so good.
It's just like, I guess it's hard to describe, but it constantly like builds as Jonathan repeats the same vocal line over and over again. As like all the instrumentation like builds behind him, you have this, especially towards the end, you have this fantastic guitar riff that comes in that is just gorgeous.
Spring, Sun, Winter, Dread builds beautiful, ends fantastically, and then immediately transitions into The Wheel is Turning Now, which is a very dark sounding track. It's easily one of the darkest that has appeared so far on the album.
Yeah, definitely. The way that this track transitions like into this very harsh electronic sound, that it's very interesting, especially I guess it especially makes sense with the lyrical content being generally about the politicians, especially like far-right politicians, kind of co-opting imagery and rhetoric of like working class people and using it to push their shitty agendas.
Yeah, this track is very, very political, talking about political and religious figures and how Jonathan is maybe not a fan of some practices among them.
I also really love the outro to this track. That's kind of like, it's like kind of almost haunting in a way. It's very depressing sounding, and I think like at that point in the track it's sort of like Jonathan, like I guess trying to get people to realize like these people are just gonna like take away all of the like progress we've made, essentially. This track, I guess, is rather conveniently transitions into Fortune 500, which I mentioned earlier. The song's about essentially someone who's been radicalized killing the Queen.
Which, if you want political change in the UK, the Queen is not the person to assassinate. Just saying.
This is a very interesting track, especially with the refrain that happens where Jonathan is singing from the point of view of the person who is killing the Queen. And there's this refrain where he goes, I've won, they've told me that I've won, and then just repeats over and over, which kind of seems like it's emphasizing not only the, like, killer's idea that he's, like, in his, like, made-up, in his, like, this, like, fantasy that he's made up, essentially, that he's, like, won, he's, like, defeated the enemy, but I guess also to some extent, like, it seems like there's some self-doubt there that he doesn't actually know if what he did was good. The instrumentation on this track is very interesting. You have these, like, very aggressive rolling synths, as well as these very rich sounding horns throughout. I mean, it gives it almost like a royal sound to it. He is running into Buckingham Palace to kill the queen. But also they just add, like, so much atmosphere to the track. I love them.
I love this track. It just sounds great. A small note, it's listed as Future 500 on Spotify. That's just a mistake on Spotify's part.
Yeah. It's actually Fortune 500.
There's also, on the deluxe edition, We Sleep in Paris. It's actually We Sleep in Pairs. I don't know why it's, like, messed up. I don't know why it hasn't been fixed yet either, but just a note.
Then from Fortune 500, we quickly transition into Blast Doors, which is, like, the verses on this track feel, like, very explosive almost. It feels like you're, like, really building up to something with these, like, fast-paced, plucked guitar riffs. And, like, Jonathan's very, like, fast-paced vocal delivery.
Yeah, this track feels like Jonathan's, like, lashing out at everything around him. And the instrument definitely complements that. These very staccato plucked guitar. And just the fast pacing of the entire track. It just sounds really cool.
He goes, like, full on with the falsetto on the pre-chorus. He really stretches his vocal range. And, like, comes down with this very groovy, wonderful chorus. And that transitions into the next song, Zero Pharaoh. But on this track, I love the like, beat that's created with, I think it's like a vocal sample that is just, like, repeated really quickly. It sounds super interesting. You have this very, like, smooth sounding chorus. I don't know how to describe it. But, like, you have Jonathan's vocals mixed with these repeated, like, background or backing vocals that are just, like, offset slightly. Give it, like, a super interesting sound. I especially love the bridge with the repeated "give me the gun" phrase over and over again. That part I think also sounds fantastic.
This track is definitely, it sounds great. So much interesting instrumentation all over it. It seems to be about there's a lack of leadership in seizing it, or overthrowing leadership and seizing it, especially in reference to, like, the "give me the gun" lines. The next track, No Reptiles, probably one of the less political ones. It references politics, especially with the title No Reptiles, talking about how the lizard people run the government, obviously.
This is, like, a super, like, it has a super unique, like, feel and beat to it. There's, like, this bouncy, repeated synth throughout, but it's very, very, like, quiet sounding, and it definitely has, like, almost, like, a depressing feel to it. This track's, like, super interesting. Especially the, like, two bridges that occur. You have, I was in the war, you were in the war, and later, I was on my knees, you were on your knees. And then the final bridge, you have, I'm going to kill a stranger, so don't you be a stranger. This track, especially the refrain at the end, which I love, it's such a weirdly unique way of putting this feeling. But he says, oh baby, it's alright to feel like a fat child in a pushchair, old enough to run. It's weirdly comforting, like this. It's such an interesting way to describe this, like, feeling of being useless as an adult and not knowing what to do.
I kind of interpret it as being, like, all right to be afraid. I just want to say, those two lines, I'm going to kill a stranger, so don't you be a stranger, are probably my two favorite lines off this entire album. I love how they work within the track and kind of within the album as a whole, thinking about the themes that are presented.
I especially also love how the outro of the track, like, constantly builds, and, like, as it builds, more and more, like, layers of instrumentation come in, and it just sounds gorgeous towards the end.
I also love the outro on this track too. You get the final track, Warm Healer.
This track's very groovy with, like, this super infectious bass line. I want to say that throughout the album, the bass lines are, like, amazing. They consistently sound amazing and also are, like, super well produced.
I definitely have to agree about the bass. It is probably the most present on this track because the track right out the gate starts off with this, like, walking bass line. It sounds really great. This track seems to be about letting go of things, which fits in really well as the closer to the album.
Yeah, definitely. I love, again, Jonathan's vocals on this track fit really well. They're very subdued and low-key feeling. I think they sound very delicate, and I think that works very well for this track. I love the super bright and wonderful sounding chorus. And I mean, the chorus in general, I think, like, it's about, like, forgiving someone for doing something. It's, like, a really, like, wonderful end to this album, I think.
Personally, I love this album. It has beautiful production throughout. The lyrics are very poetic, and they're also very dense. You can get a lot out of them looking through them. Jonathan Higgs, he proves himself to be a very capable vocalist and a very unique vocalist on this record. And just the cohesive theming throughout the album, and how also approachable it is. Just about every aspect just works so well. It sounds great. Would recommend to anybody. Personally, it's a 9.5 out of 10.
Yeah, like, I have to agree with everything you said. It's so beautifully produced. It has super gorgeous instrumentation that is really accessible, but also it is very, like, it's still experimental. I think this is a great album to actually get people into more experimental music too. There's a lot of, like, interesting sounds and concepts and guitar riffs that are used on this record. It has some fantastic lyrics and vocals throughout, and it flows so well. Like, I don't know if I have any complaints about this record. I've been, like, thinking about it for a while. I think I'm actually gonna give this record a 10. Everything about it is, like, incredible. Please listen to it. This record came out, and I think a lot of people listened to it and then maybe kind of forgot about it after a while. If you're someone who heard it and then hasn't gone back to it, please go back to it. It is such a fantastic record. Thank you for watching this episode of Deep Dive into the Archive. If you enjoyed it, please consider giving it a like and subscribing. Also, you can check out other episodes of Deep Dive into the Archive, or you can check out Album Swap. We have some cool episodes of that coming up. So, yeah, I hope you have a great day.